Hi class. The purpose of this video is to get very specific about the three-part written assignment instructions. Now, nothing I say in this video is really distinct from what's in the instructions, but it's easier to maybe understand what's going on with a few examples and really emphasize what is expected in each section. And I'm also going to draw attention to some of the pitfalls and places where students end up missing a lot of points for basically for not following instructions right. So that's all we're up to. Video is in a sense optional then, but I strongly recommend it. So in the video, in the written assignment, we are going to use philosophical analysis to try to actually resolve an issue. And that's not as easy as it sounds. And so we're going to walk before we can run and do it in three parts. And what I'm going to do first is just a general outline before getting into the specific parts much more specifically. So the general outline. We're going to pick a controversy. And a controversy where there's a dispute about ethics or some other philosophical aspect, such as justice. So we're not interested in dispute of facts. Typical examples, obviously you could use whatever you want, but things like, should there be capital punishment? Notice we say a should means we're talking philosophical ethical discourse. Or is abortion morally permissible or impermissible? Or what is the government's role in terms of welfare or healthcare? Again, these imply implicit shoulds, which means they are, in fact, philosophical debates. So things that aren't philosophical aren't going to work here. What is my religion's interpretation of abortion? That's not a philosophy question. Is there man-made climate change? That's a dispute. If it's a dispute at all, it's a dispute in the sciences. It's not a dispute in philosophy. By contrast, given that there is man-made climate change, what is the government's role, or what should the government's role be? That's a philosophical question if you want to write on that topic. So just make sure you're picking a philosophical topic. Notice in the instructions, it strongly recommends you get topical approval by me. That's actually to make your life easier. That helps you avoid topics that aren't philosophical topics. That's a grade killer. But it also helps make sure you're kind of narrow enough. So, for instance, abortion generally is actually a really big topic. And there are different moral considerations for different situations and different types. And so I might suggest you narrow it down some if you sent me that kind of topic. So make sure you're emailing me your topic for approval early enough to start working on it. All right. Anyway, you pick a topic and then you explain why it's a controversy. That is, you give really like what you take to be the best arguments on both sides and help figure out exactly where the dispute lies. If it's a philosophical dispute, the dispute should be somewhere in the philosophy. Let's say you're writing about capital punishment and you're considering this particular type of closure for the victim's family on one side and the 4% of people we execute being innocent on the other side. And you say, well, we need to figure out what is required for justice in order, because justice plays on both those sides. And if we had a clear notion of justice, then we could move on. That would be approximately part one. Part two, let's get that clear notion of justice. So part two, you just pick a concept or principle and you do a very clear, as introductory level clear, analysis of that concept. You're trying to arrive at your own proper definition of, say, justice. And we'll talk more about how to do that when we extend into the part two. And that's it. For part two, you're just trying to get clear on that concept or principle. Part three, you take your concept of you take your concept of justice, then you go find a philosopher who has also worked on a concept of justice, say John Rawls. And then part 3, you do a couple things. 1, you clearly present Rawls's account. 2, you now have your account of justice, Rawls's account of justice, and so you apply both to the original topic. The example I was using is capital punishment, and figure out what the answer is. So that is the project in 4 minutes, but let's talk a lot more about each section and what is expected. So part 1, you introduce the controversy, which means you just talk about what the controversy is and why it's a controversy. That is, I want the best arguments on both sides, or you're creating a straw man. I don't want great arguments on one side and terrible arguments on the other side. If you think there's no good arguments on the other side, it's not a controversy. Don't write about it. So you want to provide good reasons on both sides. More generally, if you're picking a topic that you're so set on that you can't even understand what the other side is saying, don't do that, because you'll just write a horribly biased paper and it's not gonna go well grade-wise. Now, by contrast, if you really think you're correct, but you've heard good arguments on the other side, that's a great topic, because then you're going to engage in critical thinking. One thing that people forget, it's okay to change your mind. That's what adults do. Okay, and that's part of critical thinking. If you write on this topic and as it turns out, you should be on the other side, that's great. That's wonderful. So just pick a topic that you can see the other side. Okay. And again, has to be a philosophical topic. So please run your topics past me, and I might help narrow them down too. Let me just give a few more other examples. Animal ethics is not a topic. It's a field of inquiry. Because the philosophy and the ethics is going to be different depending on what you do. The considerations for subsistence farming are different than factory farming. There's different ethical considerations involved, which is also different from mink farming for fur, which is also different from animal testing for life-saving medicine versus animal testing for cosmetics. All of these involve different considerations in ethics, and so you want to narrow down the topic to one set of considerations. Or very similarly, euthanasia. There's active versus passive, and there's also physician-assisted suicide. So these, if things can have different moral considerations, you don't want to write on all of them. Your goal is to do one. And if it helps, think of one specific situation. If you want if instead of capital punishment in general, you want to talk capital punishment on this case, that's actually good. That's nice and narrow. So just run it past me. Now, what am I looking for in part 1? I already said, develop the controversy. Good considerations on both sides. Got to have those for full credit. The second thing you do is to draw out what moral concepts or principles are involved. Any philosophical concept or principle is involved in order to resolve the controversy. So the example I already gave was capital punishment, and I used specifically arguments on both sides that involve justice. So notice executing innocent is an issue of justice. Closure of a certain sort for the family is an issue of justice. And so when you're trying to draw out your concepts, you should be drawing them out from what you've written, from the considerations above. And so by contrast, if you say, well, against capital punishment, it costs more than execution. It costs more than life in prison. Capital punishment costs more than life in prison. And it isn't a more effective deterrent. Well, those are practical issues that have to do with not justice, but kind of the government's role. Is the government obligated to be fiscally responsible in certain ways? Is the government obligated to be efficient in certain ways? So whatever concepts and principles involved you're drawing out should be drawn out from your reasons you present on both sides, not whatever popular reasons. So what kind of concepts and principles might there be? Some principles might be things like, what is the government's role in terms of healthcare? Or, what is the principle we're looking for is, what is the government's obligations involving the health of citizens? Or when is it okay to sacrifice few lives to save many? Those are examples of principles. Concepts are things like justice, or human nature, human rights. And so there's some lists of possible examples on the written instructions, but just more generally, what kind of philosophical things are being used in a fuzzy way that makes this an unclear issue? So just a few more examples, just in case that's not clear enough. What is the relationship? What is the value of animal happiness? Right? That's non-human animal happiness is what's at the center of factory farming. Is that worth the trade-off to get cheaper food? So those are some examples of principles and concepts. So the second thing you need to do in part 1, well, these are the principles or concepts involved. You don't have to identify all of them. It's always better to explain 1 or 2 well than 5 quickly. And then the third thing I'm expecting in part 1 is to explain how or why getting these principles or concepts pinned down would resolve the issue. You're not resolving the issue, but you're setting yourself a roadmap. So what would that look like? Well, if we knew what justice truly meant within the legal system, then we would know whether this type of closure is required for justice or not, and since that's really the only argument for capital punishment, that would tell us whether we should have it. That kind of thing. Or if we resolve to what degree the government is required to make sure we are healthy, that would tell us whether they're obligated to provide certain types of health care. Whether a fetus is a human or not is essential to the permissibility of abortion, then, well, getting really clear on when something is a human and when it has human rights would determine whether that's permissible or impermissible. So those are the kind of things I look for. So in part 1, the topic and the controversy. So explain why it's controversial by presenting reasons on both sides that should involve philosophy. Second thing I look for, and you draw out what those philosophical considerations are, what concepts or principles need to be pinned down in order to resolve the controversy. And then the third part, how pinning those down would in fact resolve it. That's it for part 1. Part 1 is your coach pitch, right? Part 1, you follow the instructions and you should get an A. So the main pitfalls, people pick topics they shouldn't pick after ignoring my strong suggestion to get your topic approved. People try to resolve the issue in part 1, or worse, make it into a thesis paper. Or part 3, present a really biased picture where there's bad reasons or no reasons on one side. Those are kind of the 3 grade killers. And then expected depth. Some people confuse, so notice each part has a word count. And sometimes people think the word count at the end of part 1 is for all 3 parts instead of just part 1. So make sure you're writing with sufficient depth and clarity. And related to that, you definitely want to see the succeeding in the course document and the grade announcement about why it's important to write to show understanding. And that takes a little time. You need to use your words and write a little extra in order to be sure you're clear. All right, part 2 is sometimes the hardest part. Now, in the instructions, I say a good practice is to not even mention your topic. So if you're writing on abortion, the word abortion shouldn't come up. Or if you're writing on capital punishment, it shouldn't. That's not a requirement so much as making sure you're doing the right thing. Because what you're doing in part 2, part 1 says, we need to clarify these concepts. Part 2, you're clarifying those concepts. And so if you're doing the capital punishment one and writing on justice, by the way, please don't just write this because I'm using it as an extended example. Use whatever topic you're interested in. But if I decided I need to figure out justice, part 2 is trying to figure out justice. That's it. If part 1 said we need to figure out what is the value of animal happiness in relation to human, part 2 is trying to figure that out. At an introductory level. So this is not easy. I have books on my wall that are trying to define justice, and they run 600-700 pages. But we're looking at a good introductory effort. So what should we be looking for? Let me pause here. I'm doing the same video for 2 classes because I'm a little lazy. So if you are in the intro class, think of the Euthyphro, right? They start with this general notion, and they start looking at reasons why it's not necessary or sufficient, and they keep doing that to try to hone down and work towards a working definition of piety at the end. That's the kind of thing you're doing. Or if you're in the ethics class, a great example was from Unit 1, the JJT's presentation of the trolley problem. The principle she's trying to arrive at is, when is it okay to sacrifice the few to save the many? And she used thought experiments to kind of eliminate those knee-jerk reactions. So, and slowly working her way towards it. So what are we looking for? Yeah, you can start in part 2. You can start with a popular notion if you want, but that's your starting point. Never in the history of mankind has a paper been enriched by giving a definition from the dictionary. Let me just tell you that in college, stop. It's never helpful. Dictionaries, all they do is try to capture popular usage. And so they're in no way authoritative, they're in no way enlightening, and they're in no way insightful. The dictionary definition just says this is how people use words. If you want to start with a dictionary definition and then start trying to fix it, that's great. But yeah, every professor ever hates when you start a paper with a dictionary definition. So the goal is to arrive at a defensible view. And that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for, are they considering obvious cases? So let me give an example of a time a student did not. The student was clearly wanting to say abortion was impermissible and decided that they needed to define what makes a human. And of course, they were trying to stack the deck so a fetus was a human. And they defined a human as something that contained human DNA as the culmination of their part 2. Well, my fingernail clippings contain human DNA. Clearly not humans. And these are the kind of things that I'm expecting you to work through, right? Well, if you start with this standard knee-jerk stuff, think deeper. Think of, does it capture all the cases? In this, it clearly does not. Or if you read the trolley problem, think about, well, if we just put it in terms of killing and let die, the Switchman example actually shows that doesn't work. And so what I'm looking for in part 2 is that you try. What does it mean to try? You do a good effort of your own work, and you try to think it through. You try to think of the kinds of things that are going to be problematic for your view, and you try to work through it. Now, what else can you do with all your time in part 2? Defend it. Show that it gets the right answer in some easy cases, and maybe even show it gets the right answer in some harder cases. But again, not your original case. So if you're developing a notion of justice, show that it gets the right answer in terms of theft, or that it gets the right answer in terms of inheritance. That's a way to defend the view and bolster your case. And And so that's a good way to defend and show that your definition is moving in the right direction. It's a little bit open-ended, but think in terms of what I'm doing as a grader. If I think there's obvious cases where your definition doesn't apply, that's going to lose some points. And so, imagine a stubborn little Socrates needling you with these questions. And if you say, for instance, if you put the definition of punishment of justice purely in terms of punishment, well, that doesn't seem to say anything about, say, the justness of keeping promises. And so just be careful. What am I looking for? So first of all, your part 2 should pretty much end, either the last sentence or at least the last paragraph, with what your working definition of that concept or principle will be. If I can't tell what your concept or principle is at the end, you haven't written with sufficient clarity. So don't say, well, here's a definition, here's a definition, here's a definition, here's a definition, and that's it. Be clear, are you trying to combine them all? What is your working definition? Because that's going to be essential for part 3. So what am I looking for in part 2? That it ends with a defensible definition. That's yours, by the way. We're not interested in other people's definitions of justice right now. We're interested in your definition. And the rest, I'm just looking for insight. I'm looking for, did you think it through? Did you work through some of the difficulties? Did you make it defensible? You don't have to convince me. You have to show me that you basically did the college try. And that's it. So common pitfalls in this one. 1, they do research and find somebody else's definition. Part 2 shouldn't really require any research because we'll get there. That's what part 3 is doing. Other pitfalls, they bias, that you try to stack the deck to get the answer you want in part 3, even if it means a bad concept or bad principle. And so part 3, the third part then, is just not thinking through all the cases. Of course, you can't think through all the cases, but make sure you sit there and think, what would a skeptic say about this? What would somebody who's trying to reject my definition, where would they, work at the edges and find something? And that's a good way to make sure you're covering the cases. So that's all. It's not easy. Part 2 is not easy, but it's a really helpful exercise because most of the time you've never looked through it. And reminder, dictionaries tell us almost nothing. They cover popular usage. If popular usage resolved the issue, it wouldn't be an issue. Our job is to go from popular usage, which is what we all started the course with, to something that we can actually use with sufficient precision, understanding, and insight to start resolving things. So that's part 2. Again, if you're in the intro class, think of the Euthyphro working towards the definition of piety. If you're in the ethics class, think of JJT working towards a principle in the trolley problem of when is it okay to sacrifice few to save many. That's the kind of thing we're looking for. All right, part 3. You're going to be doing several things here. Thing 1, find a philosopher who works on the same issue as you identified in part 2. Yes, it has to be a philosopher. That's not because I'm in some way biased. It's because these are the people who do it professionally. And when you start doing things like theologians and physicists, you're not going to get the kind of caliber expertise you need. These are, if you're interested in geography, you ask a geographer. You don't ask a biologist. And so that's just when we're matching expertise to fields, that's who's the expert in these things we're talking about. So make sure they're a professional philosopher. Every once in a while, you'll get like off an EDU page, and it's like some grad student doing a weird project or something. Or you could do like a group of philosophy. So if it's an ethics issue and you want to do utilitarianism rather than a specific utilitarian, that's fine. But having said all of this, yes, this is the section that will require research, but it's not going to be as burdensome as you might think because, first of all, when I grade part 2, I will mention, hey, here's some figures you might want to think about that would be good for your part 3. So if you don't know who works on animal rights, well, there's probably a couple of suggestions there, or justice, etc., equality. And so you'll have that. Second thing, though, the research is required that all research be scholarly, but I don't require that you use original sources. So, for instance, if you're trying to present Rawls' views on justice, well, yeah, you could open up Rawls' book, A Theory of Justice, and go from there. But it's also certainly fine to just go to the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy and look at Rawls' the article on Rawls' notion of justice there, because that's peer-reviewed, and it's fine. So your research has to be scholarly. It does not have to be primary source. So that means there's 2 wonderful resources in philosophy. It's all peer-reviewed. I've mentioned the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy already, iep.utm.edu. That's our Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Everything there is peer-reviewed by experts. There's also the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's the articles are a little more complex there, but again, peer-reviewed, written by experts. That's plato.stanford.edu. So either of those, I can vouch for every article on there as scholarly. No problem. You can use those to your heart's content. Things that aren't scholarly, SparkNotes, Wikipedia, the like. If you want to know whether an article's scholarly, your library actually has a search feature where you could just limit the search to scholarly articles. It's not hard. So if you are having trouble finding sources, obviously feel free to email me and reach out. We'll talk about them. But because I don't require primary sources, it should be pretty easy. So roughly speaking, figure about 40%, 30 or 40% of your paper presenting some philosopher's view on the concept or principle you're working with. And what do I look for? Accuracy, relevance. If I suggest you write on Aristotle on virtue ethics and you write on Aristotle on human nature, there might not be a good match there. The goal is to write on the same topic as you wrote on for part 2. Then, small part of the paper, 20%, a paragraph or 2, you now have, again, extending the example, your definition of justice, and you have Rawls's definition of justice. Your next step in part 3 is to apply both to the original topic. So if we're using Rawls's definition of justice, here's what it says about the capital punishment debate I presented in part 1 and why. Then use yours. If we're using my definition of capital punishment, here's what it says about the controversy in part 1 and why. Be sure to explain why clearly. That's a common misstep. They'd say this. Well, make clear that you got the right answer and how. The last 40% of the paper is open-ended, looking for insight. It's just kind of a compare and contrast. What does this tell you? So things you could talk about. You could compare and contrast the definitions. Well, did Rawls go a very different route on justice than you did, and why? Are there things that one included that the other left out? Is that significant, and why? But then also talk about the applications to the original topic. What does this tell you about the ethics of capital punishment? Did the two concepts get the same answer? If so, what's the significance there? Did they get different answers? If so, what accounts for the difference, and which way should we go, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's pretty open-ended. Again, the chief grade is insight, and part of insight is using your work. So it always drives me crazy when I'm like, well, my definition of justice says capital punishment's immoral. Rawls's definition says capital punishment's immoral, but I'm still in favor of capital punishment. You just did all the work that said you shouldn't be, or vice versa. And so really use your work. This is part of using philosophy as part of the general goal of critical thinking. And if you at the end refuse to be critical, in the sense of actually thinking through these materials, if you loud and proud say, I refuse to let any type of reasoning budge me on this. That's not going to go well for your grade. Now, of course, you don't have to change your views, but don't clash with your own work. You should be using and extrapolating and engaging your work. You shouldn't be setting aside your work to believe whatever you feel like. So, in a half-hour-long nutshell, that's what we're doing in these papers. So just rewatch this as necessary, or the sections as necessary. Pay special attention to the big pitfalls I've identified in each one, and also what I'm grading on, what I'm looking for. I'm very specific about this because the challenge of this project shouldn't be knowing how to follow the instructions. The challenge should be learning to apply these higher level types of thought in real life. That's really what we're working on. I would much rather start with the assumption that everyone is doing the assignment how they're supposed to, and see what kind of fun and insightful things fall out. That's when this project's fun. It really is. So I want everybody to do well. If you have any questions whatsoever, please either post them on the Ask Your Instructor, or of course you could always email me directly. You could also do topic approval on the Ask Your Instructor, by the way, because my answers might be enlightening to your classmates as well. But that's what we're up to. And so I really hope I get a bunch of awesome papers, because everybody's going into it prepared and excited, and we'll see how it goes.